Welcome to H2K Infosys. H2K Infosys is a e-verify business based in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. We provide 100% job-oriented, instructor-led, face-to-face, true live online software training programs. It also includes access to cloud test lab with software tools. We provide live project for you to work on. We also provide assistance with mock interviews, resume preparation and review, and job placement assistance. H2K Infosys is trusted by so many students across the world. H2K Infosys provides world-class services in IT training with real-time project work for corporates and individuals, special IT training for MS students in the United States, software design, development, QA manual and automation, performance testing and maintenance, IT staff augmentation, job placement assistance, and tech support.
That was a rate of classes, interfaces, or anything. Okay. So we're going to discuss about exceptions. So folks, what is an exception? What is an exception? Any idea?
An error which errors.
Actually, an exception is any problem that arises during the execution of the program, right? If there is any problem that occurs during the execution of the program is getting executed and we're getting a problem, right? That exception can occur because of many reasons. There might be many reasons which causes exception. When the user enters an invalid data, right? When the user is entering an invalid data, we can get exception because of that. And let's say we are trying to open a file as a C colon users, and I'm trying to open exception handling.pdf. I'm trying to open it. If the system cannot find that file, there is a problem. There is an error that arises with that. And for example, we are communicating or we're sending data over a network. And at that instance, JVM has ran out of memory. That is also a problem, right? So there are different kind of problems which might cause an exception, right? So some of these exceptions are caused by user errors. Means there are some errors that are caused because of the code that we write, or the programmer's errors, or the errors that are caused because of the code that we write. There are certain kind of exceptions. And other exceptions are caused, by the failure of physical resources. We have a database. We're trying to connect to a database. The database is down, right? So we get error because of that. So there are two kind of problems that we get. One kind of problems we get because of the programmer's error. Because of the code that we write, we get those errors. And the other errors, they cause because of the failure of the physical resources of the database. So we classify these problems into two different types: exceptions and errors. So folks, you see this hierarchical diagram? There is a superclass throwable, from which error and exception are extended. Throwable is the superclass for both error and exception. So what is an error and what is an exception? Error is something which is not raised by the programmer's code and we cannot handle it. Error is something that is caused because of failure of some physical resources and it is not raised by the programmer code. That is what we call it as an error. So it is not caused by our code and we cannot handle an error. Error is something which is not raised because of the programmer's code, and error cannot be handled. Then what is an exception? Exception is some sort of a problem which is caused by the code that we write. Exception is caused by the programmer's code, and exception can be handled. Exception is raised because of the code that we write, and exception can be handled. And folks, in exception we have two kinds of exceptions. One is checked exception and the other is runtime exception. So what is a checked exception? A checked exception is something wherein the programmer can foresee it. So how can the programmer foresee it? When we are writing code, if there is a checked exception, right? What the compiler do? The compiler gives us a compilation error. We get a compilation error, and the compiler forces us to handle it. We cannot simply ignore the exception during the compilation time. So when we don't handle a checked exception, the code does not get compiled. These exceptions, the checked exceptions, cannot be ignored at the time of compilation. So when there is a checked exception in the code, we get a compilation error and we have to handle it. But what is a runtime exception? A runtime exception cannot be foreseen by the programmer, and even the compiler doesn't say anything about the runtime exception. If there is a runtime exception, the code gets compiled, but when we run the code, the runtime exceptions are ignored by the compiler, or they get ignored at the compilation time. And when we run the code, we get runtime exception. So, folks, all the problems in Java are the object of throwable. We have errors and exceptions. Errors is something that is not raised because of the programmer's code, and it cannot be handled. And exception is something that is caused because of the programmer's code, and it can be handled. And there are two kinds of exceptions. One is the checked exceptions, and the other is the runtime exception. Checked exceptions are checked by the compiler, and the compiler forces us to handle them by giving a compilation error. Whereas the runtime exceptions cannot be handled, cannot be interpreted, or the compiler cannot find it. And the code gets compiled, but when we run the code, we get a runtime exception. Folks, any doubts on what is an exception, or what is an exception, what is an error, or what is a checked exception and a runtime exception?
They are what examples of IO exception actually?
When we try to open a file, right, it throws the checked exception, IO exception, and it forces us to handle it. That is what is IO exception is. IO exception is a checked exception.
And runtime exceptions are, for example, if we have something
Null
like
pointer exception, right?
Okay.
Null pointer exception and array index out of bound exception. See, let's say I have this string s is equal to abc. Okay, instead of abc, I make it as null. Okay, and I say s dot through lowercase here, right? So in this line, we get an exception, which is null pointer exception, because s is not pointing to any object. S is null, but we are trying to call a method on it, right? So this gives us null pointer exception. See, folks, we are not getting any compilation error, right? But when we run the code, See, it is giving an exception, null pointer exception, right? So how did I say this is a runtime exception? Could anyone explain me why did I say this exception is a runtime exception?
Because the code of failed when you executed it. I mean, if you had handled the code, then we would not have got this type of exception, right?
No, it's not. We have not gone to handling. This is a runtime exception. Why did I say this is a runtime exception?
The compiler did not force it.
Exactly. The compiler did not give any error for me, right? The compiler did not give any error for me. But when I run the code, I got an exception. This is what we were talking about, the runtime exception, right? The compiler cannot give a runtime exception. Or it doesn't, I mean, the programmer cannot force a runtime exception, or the compiler doesn't prompt you saying there is an exception that's going to happen here, right? The compiler doesn't say anything about a runtime exception. But when we run the code, we get exception at the runtime. That is what we call them as the runtime exception. So folks, what is a compile time exception? See, here I'm trying to do, I'm calling a sleep method. We discussed about threads in detail. Tomorrow's class probably, after exception, it's thread. So, but let's see, there is a method in sleep in thread class, okay? And I'm calling a sleep method. So it is giving me compilation error. What does it say? Unhandled exception type interrupted exception. Folks, what is interrupted exception? Is it a checked exception or a runtime exception, folks?
Exception.
It is a checked exception. Because the compiler is giving us a compilation error and it is forcing us to handle it or declare it. It is asking us to handle it. Right? We're going to discuss about try catch. What is handling? I just want you people to understand the difference between a checked exception and the runtime exception. Folks, everyone, are you clear on the difference between what is a checked and what is the runtime exception?
Yeah.
So, in this particular line, it is forcing us, it is giving us a compilation error, right? We call them as a compile time exceptions or checked exceptions. But unlike the null pointer exception, it is not giving any error here. There is an exception, there is a null pointer exception that occurs in this line. But the compiler is not saying anything. But we got an exception when we ran the code, when we executed the code. This is runtime exception. And all the exceptions and errors in Java are subclasses of java.lang.throwable. What's your doubt? Someone asking something?
So in short, due to this runtime exception, the program has stopped executing. That's it. I mean,
Yes, exactly. See, even though if you have a compile time exception, right, it's a checked exception. If that exception occurs, right, we're like handling it. But a runtime exception, what I'm trying to say is a runtime exception not, cannot be checked at the compile time. You understand the concept?
okay.
Like when during the compile time, we cannot see that exception. It's see, as a programmer, we can say, I know S is null. When I do it, I'll get an exception. We know it. I'm not talking from that perspective. From the system's perspective, from the compiler perspective, let me tell you this. From the compiler perspective, the compiler cannot see that there is an exception that might happen on that line. And it is not giving us any, it is not forcing us to handle it, right? Or to do something for it, right? That is what is the difference between a checked exception and a runtime exception. And folks, we have certain methods that are present in the throwable class. And these are all public methods. And as exception and error extends throwable class, both exception and an error has all these methods. So these methods, like when an exception occurs or when an error occurs, To get the information about the exception or the error, we use these methods. So we have the get message method, which returns a string. And what is a string? It is the detailed message about the exception has occurred. It gives us the message on, about the exception that has occurred. And we have get cause. So what is get cause? It returns the cause of the exception. Like, what is the reason that this exception has occurred? It returns the cause for the exception. And there is a toString method. So toString method comes from the object class. We have discussed in previous classes that object class is the super class of all the classes, right? And we have toString method in the object class, so all the classes get the toString. But in the throwable, they have overridden it. So what does it return? It returns the name of the class, and it, in addition to the name of the class, whatever the get message returns, it appends to the class name. So whatever it returns us is the class name plus get message, whatever the get message returns. And we have the print stack trace. So it prints, when I call this method, it presents the result of the toString and along with the stack trace to system.error. So what is the difference between system.error and system.out? System.error writes to the error output stream. System.out is just it writes to the console. System.error is the error output. And we have the get stack trace method, which returns an array of stack trace elements starting from index 0. So, okay, this has occurred in this specific line, and this has called from this specific line. We have a list of stack traces, we have an array of stack traces that is returned. And we have one more method, fill in stack trace. So what happens? The stack trace of the throwable object. When an exception is raised, what is it? It's an object, right? Everything is an exception in Java. Even when an exception is thrown, it is an object. So it appends the stack trace with the current stack trace. So you have the previous information and the current information about the exception as well. So these are the methods that we use to get some information about the exception, basically. Different methods which comes from the throwable class. So exception and error both have this kind of all these methods. And so whatever exception we have in Java are the subclasses of the exception class. We take null pointer exception. We call array index out of bound exception, right? And folks, remember, we saw class cast exception also. Folks, any one of you, when do we get class cast exception?
When we assign, child
Superclass object to a subclass reference, right? Folks, everyone, I'm just reiterating. When we assign a superclass object to a subclass reference, here it's a very important thing. We should never assign a subclass object to a superclass reference. So, folks, so what am I doing here? I'm assigning a superclass object to a subclass reference. When it gives me compilation error, I can add a cast to resolve the compilation error. But so what is the error here? Vehicle is an abstract class, right? We cannot create object of an abstract class. That's the reason it was giving me error. We cannot create object of an abstract class. So I got rid of the compilation error by doing a cast. I'm assigning a superclass object to a subclass. See, when I run the code, it gives me an exception, and it is class cast exception. You see this code? So what is class cast exception? Is it a checked exception or a runtime exception?
runtime exception.
Good. It's a runtime exception. no matter what, like check the exceptions, runtime exceptions, array index out of bound, class test exception, all exceptions in Java are the classes of java.lang.exception. See, we have this exception is in the java.lang package. Java.lang.exception is the superclass of all the exceptions in Java. So we're saying handling exceptions, right? So how do we handle exceptions? We handle exceptions by catching them. We catch the exceptions, right? So how do we catch exceptions? By using the try catch block. So here is the syntax how we catch exceptions. We use the try catch block to handle exceptions. So what is the code that we put in the try block and what is the code that we're going to put in the catch block? So if we think that some code might throw exception, if there is some code which might throw exception, the code that we think that it might throw exception, we keep it in the try block. When an exception is thrown, we got an exception is thrown. What do we want to do when an exception is thrown? Right? That particular piece of code, we keep it in the catch block. For example, let's say in the try block, I got a class cast exception. Okay? Here in the catch block, I say catch of class cast exception. And I put a system.out.println in the catch block saying you cannot assign a superclass object to a subclass reference. So when I put that code in the catch block, when a class cast exception is thrown, what happens? It prints that to the console. You understand? The code which we think it might throw exception, we keep it in the try block. What do we exactly want to do? When an exception is thrown, how do you want to handle it? What do you want to do? For example, I want to write something to the console saying a superclass object cannot be assigned to a subclass reference. That particular piece of code of the system.out.println, I keep it in the catch block. So let's see, folks. Here, see, this is a check. I'm just taking note of the code. So here, folks, you see, I am here in this particular line, an null pointer exception will be thrown, right? Folks, why do we get null pointer exception here? Because S is null and we are trying to call a method on S, right? So we get a null pointer exception, right? So folks, if you observe here, we wrote a catch block which catches null pointer exception. So what is my output when I run this code? What will be my output when I run this code?
Null pointer exception.
Yes. Folks, if you observe something, see, when there is an exception in this line, the code after this line in the try block doesn't get executed. See, I'm printing I of 1, which should be 2. It should print me 2, right? Because of this exception, when an exception is thrown here, the code after an exception is thrown, doesn't get executed. The control comes to the catch block and see if there is any matching catch block for this. We have the null pointer exception catch block, right? So it executes the code in the catch block. And then we are printing the string. So it is printing string. We haven't assigned any value to it, and string S is equal to null. So folks, any doubts on this? Whatever the code after the exception occurs, that doesn't get executed. Let's say, for example, S is string S is equal to ABC. So folks, what will be my output now?
So null pointer exception and ADC.
No, it will be ABC. It will be the print one, that is 2 and ABC.
Yes. This line, it doesn't throw any exception because this is really pointing to an object right now. And it prints I of 1. Folks, arrays are zero index in Java. So when I say when I have an array of 2 elements, the first one is I of 0 and the second one is I of 1. So it is printing me 2 and then it is printing me string s. Okay? So what will be my output now?
Yeah, where is the printing to? Okay, I see that in the bottom.
Yeah, here see. You see it here?
I see.
Okay, so what will be my output now? I'm trying to access I of 2.
It will crash. I mean,
You're giving an array out of bounds exception.
Yes. When we try to access the array out of its bounds. So now when I have 2 elements in an array, I have I of 0, I of 1. I don't have I of 2 or I of 3. When we try to access the array out of its bounds, we get an array index out of bound exception. So folks, what will be my output?
ABC and array index out of bound.
it will crash because
Yes,
there is no exception for array out of bound.
exactly. So we are throwing array index out of bound exception. Is there a cache block for it? No. It comes to the cache block. Array index is not null pointer exception, right? So an exception is thrown. We are not handling it. So the program exists. Say array index out of bound exception. Right? So when an exception is thrown, there should be a matching cache block for it. So we can write multiple cache blocks. Here I can write array index out of bound exception.
So many of our students have given testimonials on how our training programs are. You will find them on kudzu.com and on our website h2kinfosys.com. On our website h2kinfosys.com, you will also find more detailed information on who we are, the courses that we offer, what each course covers. Also, if you're interested in a demo program, please register on our homepage on the left-hand side. Just give us more information about yourself and we will send you a link for a demo class. The demo class is absolutely free. Experience our commitment by just attending an orientation workshop at no cost. Our team of faculty and advisors are here to guide you with the right information. If you still have more questions, please feel free to call us. Call us at 770-777-1269. This is a United States number. If you're calling from the UK, call us at 020-337-17615. You can also email us at training@h2kinfosys.com or h2kinfosys@gmail.com. Thank you for watching our videos. We wish you a great career in information technology.